So thank you very much. Continue. All right. So the talk that I've got tonight is actually part of a series of talks that I run in a workshop that's called Change Your Photography. So the workshop is actually designed for people who feel they're not getting what they want out of their photography and they want to make a change. And so over the course of 5 days, we have a series of presentations, and then we go out and we do lots of hands-on work, and then we come back in and we talk about that work, and then we do some other presentations. And this particular presentation is all on light, and it's kind of one of the cornerstone things because sometimes people really struggle with light. We often hear this thing of, oh, you just need to work the light more, or that light is the most important thing. But what do people mean when they say, that light is the most important thing? What does that mean? And so really, we've got kind of a deep dive into light here. And so when we say that light is everything, it's because cameras don't see light. Sorry. Cameras don't see subjects, they see light. Light is all they see. And so we tend to think in terms of subjects, and cameras, they really only think in terms of light. Here's my friend, Ewen Rolfe, and he often joins me with workshops. The reason I put him in here is that I just really want to make the point is that if you have good light, you can make anything look good. Now, that joke works better if Ian's here, but you get the point. It's all about the light. And if you don't have good light, you don't have a good photo. And if you can start with that premise, then I think it can really take you places. One of the things that comes up so often when I'm on a tour is that people say, how do I shoot this subject? And the subject they're pointing at is in terrible light. And they say, well, you need to look for light, not subjects. And if you start with light, you can get somewhere. So I like to let the light guide me. I like to let the light take me to where I'm going to find the shots that are going to work. There are worthy subjects anywhere. Anything can be a really great shot if your light is there. And so I start with light first because the light is harder. You can't put in light later on. You can't create the light with your processing. You want to capture the light with the camera and then take that into processing. If you don't have the light when you capture it, there isn't anything you can do downstream to turn it into a different kind of vibe, because the light is what gives you color. The light is what gives you character. So let's have a think about what is good light, because good light can mean different things to different people. And in the case of Ewen Rolfe, his idea of good light is often very different to mine. We have really different styles, in Ian's style, he goes for more richer colors and much more heavier processing than I do. And even though we're worlds apart, there's often times when we will see the same scene and we'll see the light, and we are actually drawn to the same light quite often. We just use it in different ways. So what is good light to one person might not be good light to someone else, and that comes down to the style that you're trying to pursue. It also comes down to your skills with processing your raw files. So if you have certain skills, then you can take certain kinds of light and turn that into the photo that you want. And if you're then presented with a different kind of opportunity, you need different processing skills for different light. And so one of the cases in point is that I have two different kinds of standard ways that I'm going to process a file, depending on, am I starting with flat light or flat contrast, or am I starting with high contrast? So these are very different processing skills that that if I've got something that's really, really low in contrast, then I'm going to need to put in some contrast, and I'll probably need to take out some of the saturation. If I've got something that's really high in contrast, I need to make sure I don't lose my shadows and that I don't lose my highlights. So they're very different processing skills. So the more you're learning with your processing, the better opportunity you have to work in different kinds of light, and it'll change what you decide is good light. The other thing that's really changed a lot lately is that your camera sensors are just, have so much more dynamic range now than they did, say, 10 years ago. So if you go back 10 years, the camera sensors, would give you somewhere between sort of 9 or 10 stops of light. Now we're getting between 14 and 16 stops of light. So now we can shoot in much harsher light and still get a really great image that we really enjoy. So the technology in the sensors has really changed, so that we can shoot in lots of different kind of light that maybe we were going to struggle with if you go back 10 years ago. So that changes again the definition of what is good light. And we're going to talk about some different cases of light as we get through the presentation. The angle of light is, for me, is the main thing that I take an interest in when I'm trying to decide, is this light going to work for me or not? It mostly comes down to the angle of the light. The angle gives us our contrast, it gives us our color, and it gives us character. Okay, so if you put all that together, the angle is what determines the mood of that entire scene. So I think my next slide should have an example of this. Okay, that comes down at the end. All right. All right, let's go to this one. So the angle of the light is what's really going to control your color, and is going to control your contrast. And very, very subtle changes on that angle will give you profound changes in terms of how the shot works or not. Okay, so you can control contrast by changing your camera angle on the light that's coming into the lens. And it just takes a small change to make a very big effect. And by way of example here, I've got 3 shots that are taken standing in almost the same spot. And it's the same tree. And all I'm doing is I'm slightly changing where I'm shooting the tree on the angle of the light. Okay, so there's, the one on the right, I'm going straight into the sun. And so the colors are completely dropped down. They're really, they're blasted out. I've got a little bit of green and a little bit of yellow, but not much else. I've almost lost the blues. And the frame is just basically flooded with that light that's pouring in, and only the darkest things really come through. On the left, I've got the light coming through the leaves. So the light is actually hitting the leaves and the colors coming through it, and so the colors seem really, really rich. And then the one in the middle is just kind of a more standard look, where the light's probably coming from the side. And so I can still see the blue of the sky, and I get the green of the leaves. So, your angle on the light completely changes the scene, completely changes the mood of the shot. And that's really the key thing that I want you to take away from this. Let me get to the next one. The golden hour. The reason the golden hour is so good is because the angle of the light is so good. It's a very, very low angle, and that means your color's changing. Your color's changing because the light's coming through the atmosphere. And so it's turning warm because the bluer parts of the light, they get stopped in the way through particles, whereas the yellow and red tends to travel further. So you've got a shift in the color. It's not as harsh in terms of contrast. So it's easy to shoot back into the light with this this time of day, and you have those longer shadows. So, there's quite a few things that are happening at that time of day. If you compare that to like the noonday sun, when it's coming from straight overhead, that light doesn't have to pass through as much atmosphere before it reaches you, and that's why it's so much harsher and so much stronger, and so much whiter. It hasn't been tampered with as it gets through the atmosphere. So the golden hour, that gives you the sunset light, and one of the really good things about it, with that sunset, is that you now have a range of contrast to shoot from. If you shoot straight back into the light as opposed to shooting across the light, you get different contrast. And you can control the contrast, and that's the thing that you need to keep in mind. It's not as though you're turning up and saying, here's the light that you've got available to you. You decide which angle you're going to throw that camera on, and that will determine what character you're going to get out of the light. Okay, so you decide, you have control. I'm going to talk about the angle of light when it comes to still life. And in still life, I treat really differently to landscapes. So with landscapes, I really want the sunlight to come across the scene, or to come into it towards my camera. With still life, I don't want direct sunlight in the shot usually. I want it to be really soft light. So here we've got a scene that's in a window seat. So the sun is outside, but it's not coming through the window. The only light that's coming in is that very soft, diffuse light, and it's just sort of coming in through the window. And so I end up with this light that's soft, abundant, and angled. And that's really the key for all of the still life work that I do. It's soft, abundant, angled. And when I say still life, in this case, it's going to be food photography. That's just a category of still life. But soft, abundant, angled is what I look for when I'm shooting food. Because if I have too much contrast, then it's hard to pull back the shot and get the detail that I really want. I want things to be slightly more gentle when it comes to still life. Now, with portraits, I treat portraits pretty much the same as still life. To me, a portrait is the same. It's just on a slightly larger scale. And so the key with still life, I still want that soft, abundant, angled light. And here in this particular scene, the very soft light is just basically filtering in through that archway and just catching her on the side. And for me, that's perfect. That's exactly what I want out of the portrait. It's soft, it's not too harsh, and it's got some angle, and so that gives me character. And I've got some space, I've got some room to compose, so that my subject is in a context too. Okay. I won't talk about cliches and all that kind of stuff just in this particular talk. I'm just going to try to focus on the light aspect of it. But it's the larger your scene, the harder it is to control the light. And so here we have a scene where that light is coming in through the side, and so I can actually control the light, and for me that's perfect. But you can't always control the light, and you sometimes need to take your subject to somewhere where you can actually control the light, where the light's doing what you need it to do. And so when you're working with humans, and that can be hard because quite often humans want to do what they want to do, not what you want to do. And when you're working with humans, you might need to put them where the light is better so that you can get the shot that you want. And again, I was saying that the great thing about the golden hour is that you can decide how you use the light. There's not just one shot, there's lots of shots, because you get to pick your angle on the light. You get to pick what time of day you're going to shoot. You get to pick what camera angle, and you get to pick what you expose for. And we're going to talk more about how to expose with more complex light. but you get to decide, you get to manipulate the angle. So the angle of the light is what really matters, but you actually get to control that. You know, that's not just something that gets handed to you and you turn up in a place and that's the light that you got to work with. You can control when you go there, what angle that you use, what angle that you're going to use. Okay, you are in control. And I think that sometimes we tend to forget that, you know, that we are in control. Complex lighting. I love light that's complex. I don't want things to be flat and even and the same. You know, I want things that are really dark and things that are really bright and things that are in between. And I want the entire spectrum. I want as much in a single shot as I possibly can get. You know, here's a particular challenge. This particular scene, the tree is black, the white of the, you know, the small um, little prayer huts, they're, you know, they kind of blow out. So it's hard to process, you know, it's a challenge when you work with complex light. But from that challenge is how you get a more interesting options for your composition. So it's more challenging, but it's more interesting. And we talked about the idea that as you gain some skills in processing, you also gain some skills in being able to work in more complex light because you know how to process it. But the fundamental to all this is that for me, I just try to expose for my main subject. And in this shot, my main subject is actually the two men as they come up the path. You know, for me, they're the hero of the shot. They make the shot perfect. They make it complete. So I want to expose for them when I'm in camera, and then when I get it onto the desktop, I'm going to decide, well, so how dark should they be, and how bright should the, you know, the white rooftops be, and how dark should the tree be, and I then begin to work on that with my processing. But at the time when I'm out there shooting, just as a general rule to keep it simple, I expose for my subject. So I want complex light, but I want to expose for my subject. Okay, that's how I work it. Um, Shooting into the light. Um, as our camera sensors get better and better, this gets easier and easier and more rewarding. Like it used to be, we would avoid trying to shoot into the light as much as possible. We would be concerned about the flaring that's on the lens. We would be concerned that we're going to lose the definition of subjects. We would be concerned that, in fact, the detail of things in the shadows would get crushed by all that bright light. We can do a lot with the raw files now. We can pull back so much detail that we couldn't in the past. My general technique for shooting into the light is to use a very, very shallow depth of field. So, you know, something like f2. So at f2, the flaring is going to be pretty soft, so that if it is there, it's not going to basically take over the scene. And then I just basically expose for the subject. You know, I tend to say that a lot. Expose for the subject. It seems like really obvious, like you know, what else are you going to expose for? But in a scene like this, you need to tell the camera which is the bit you're trying to expose for. Your camera won't know whether you're trying to expose for the sky or expose for the very dark shadows that's in the right-hand side, or exposing for the brickwork that's on the left-hand side. Your camera doesn't know what you're seeing. So you have to tell it. And here, you know, I want basically the brickwork on the left-hand side is roughly where I want it to expose for, because I want a little bit of a, you know, I want some of the depth, some of the detail in the shadows, but I don't want too much. So, you know, I have to guide the camera as to what to expose for. And when you're shooting into the light, it's really important to let the camera know. You know, I take some test shots, I see how they come out, and I see if I need to dial exposure compensation up or down, or I can choose to read the light from part of the frame instead. So there's a couple of options there. And when you're controlling exposure, you could expose for where the light is bright instead of for where the light is dark, and that's how you're going to get a silhouette. And so, just as a general rule with silhouettes, they work better when you have contrast. If you have a fairly flat light, it's harder to get that impact. It's harder to get your blacks black without everything in the frame being crushed. You know, here the pigeon is nice and black. There's no detail in that pigeon, but I haven't crushed the contrast in the rest of the scene. So I can still hold on to shadows in part of the scene while having my black in the bit that really needs to be black. And that's because, in fact, the sun has just come up here. It's actually quite bright behind that temple. You just can't tell with the processing. But I've got a lot of contrast to begin with, and so I can dial it up or down in parts of the frame to suit. So if you're working on silhouettes, start with high contrast. It works really well. And then expose for the bright part of the frame, which here is quite obvious to see where. And then, make sure when it comes to silhouette, whatever your primary silhouette is, that's the bit that's got to be sharp. Okay, so that bit can't be soft. I can't have the pigeon here can't be soft, because then the silhouette doesn't really work then. Okay, I'm just going to race through some of these ones rather than going through all of the notes. Otherwise, we'd be here till midnight. Light metering. So we kind of touched on this idea of, if you're going to expose for the subject, how are you doing that? You need to be in control of your camera. You need to get to know how your camera works well enough that you are in control of how it's going to meter the light. So one way is to use exposure compensation, where you dial in some extra light or you take out some light, so that if you want to dial it back so that the highlights come down, that's one way to do it. You can dial it up so that the shadows get more. The other thing I use is the auto exposure lock. And these days, not every camera has that, which is kind of weird, but that's kind of where we're headed now. With the auto exposure lock, you basically set up the camera so that when you point the camera at a particular area, you tap your lock and it will take a reading of the light, and it'll hold it for you, so that when you come back to what you're trying to frame up, it's not going to re-evaluate your exposure. It's going to stick with the one that you just grabbed. And it's good because you can very quickly respond to very complex light by using that kind of function. If your camera doesn't have a dedicated button to do it, you'll be able to go into the menu and actually set that up so that your camera, so that you can assign it to one of the buttons that's on your camera. And you simply tap that button, you get a lock, and you take the shot, and you see if you're in the ballpark or not. And you see if you need to go somewhere brighter or darker to get the balance that you're looking for. Something to watch out when you're trying to heater the light is how your camera is set up to read the light off the whole screen, or just part of the screen, or just a little spot in the middle. The smaller you make the zone that it's going to read the light from, like if you go all the way to the spot, that's at one end of the spectrum. If you make it a very small spot, then you can easily throw yourself out. It can be very hard to see what the camera is doing, because if you hit the dark part of someone's shirt as opposed to the bright part of their skin, you get very, very different readings for light. So that's why I don't tend to use the spot metering. It's something I like to avoid. I can count on one hand the number of times in 20 years I've actually had to use that, and it's not very often. So in general, I stay away from that. I just use the whole grid, the whole matrix, the whole screen, however your metering is set up. I don't usually need to make it smaller and smaller, because like the smaller you make it, then small changes can give you a very different reading, and it's very hard to work out exactly what's going on. So yeah, I like to keep it simple. So exposed to the light has Um, who here has used exposed to the right as part of their photography? Is that a technique that gets used in your club much, guys? Nobody? Yeah, Glenn. Okay, so um, uh, in general, exposed to the right is something I think is actually a pretty good idea. The problem is the more complex light you're working in, the easier it is to get it wrong. And if you take a case of, um, you know, hey, the scene here with this guy in the wall, the more that you expose to the right, your camera may be reading the light in the room and not so much the light that's on his face, and you can easily blow out the highlights when you expose to the right. So exposed to the right works really well if you don't actually blow out the highlights. You just have to be careful to know how far is going to be too far for the dynamic range of your camera, and it can be easy to get that wrong. And that's the downside to trying to expose to the right. On the flip side, you can think of it as actually trying to expose for zones. If you think about Ansel Adams, and his work was all about trying to expose for zones so that he knew that when he got into the dark room, there are things that he could bring up a couple of stops, there are things that he could bring down a couple of stops, and he would expose for right in the middle between those two. And it's a really, really great idea if your brain can handle that and say, okay, well, I think I'm in the right zone here, and I think I'm in the right zone there, and I've um, got enough error within my dynamic range, and I'm going to be okay. uh, you have to work pretty hard to get the best out of the zone kind of technique. And that's why at the end of the day, I keep it simple and I simply expose for my subject. The way the sensors are now, I've got so much room above and below that exposure that if I expose for my subject, I've usually got enough room for the other things that I need to control within that scene. So, there are things you can do to expose to the right or to expose for zones. Doesn't mean that you should. Yeah. Yeah. So, a baseline. Um, one of the things that I'd like to suggest for people to think about with their technique, particularly if you're starting from scratch, you're trying to learn how your gear is going to behave under certain kind of circumstances, is to set a baseline for how you set up your camera. And so for me, I've got a custom 1, custom 2, custom 3 on the mode dial, and I punch in the baselines. I actually set up the camera so that each of the customs is actually a different baseline. So I use the mode dial to set in, and in the case of how I have my particular cameras set up, C1 is going to be aperture priority at f2. That's my standard mode. That's my the first thing I'm going to shoot is that. I'm going to be shooting at f2 because I want that shallow depth of field, because I want to highlight that one part of the frame, and I'm going to let the auto ISO do the work. Okay, I'm going to set a minimum shutter speed with the auto ISO, and it's usually something like 200th of a second. And I've just got that punched into C1 so that I know that if I roll that camera onto C1, I know exactly what it's going to do. No surprises. No, I was playing around with the ISO, and I've just spent the whole afternoon shooting everything at 6400. That doesn't happen because I simply, I'm on custom mode 1, and every time that camera powers up, it punches in the custom mode 1, and I know exactly what the baseline is. Now, the good thing with the baseline is that when you've got the baseline, there's the settings which I have in mind. When you've got your baseline, you now have a chance to step off the baseline and see what happens when you make a change. Because if you change change like 2 or 3 things at the same time, it can be very hard to learn what the camera is doing because you've changed multiple things at the same time. But if you have a baseline and you say, well, I'm going to go from F2 to F8, and then you start to take some shots, and you see what happens when you go to just change that f-stop. How does the camera respond? It now needs some extra light, so it's got to bring up the ISO, and it has to work at a higher ISO to get a shot at f8 than it does at f2 if you're in like a cloudy day, or if you're on the shady side of the street or something like that. And you start seeing what your camera is doing because you have a baseline, and then you change one thing, and you just get to learn easier through that through that process. By having the baseline, you also remove a whole bunch of distractions. You're not thinking, oh, what f-stop should I be on right now, as opposed to 10 minutes ago, because you've set that into the camera. It's punched in. That's just what you're going to use now. You start with that baseline, and you don't change it unless you need to change it. So you're trying to think about the photography, not think about the camera, because the more your head is inside the camera, your head is not inside the process of composition, and it's not inside trying to read light. Okay, so it puts you in control of the camera by using the baseline and by using those custom modes. Depending on your camera, you can also set in how the autofocus is going to work. Is it going to use the whole grid? Is it just going to use one point? Is that point going to be up here on the side? Am I going to read the light with the whole grid, or am I going to use a spot? You can punch all of that in as part of your baseline, and just know exactly what your camera is going to do when it turns on. Okay, so the custom modes and having a baseline just put you in control, so that you can start driving the camera and not let the camera drive you. All right, black and white preview. Oops, I went the wrong way there. Black and white preview. So one of the things that I like to do, I like to set my camera in black and white, so that what I'm seeing and what I'm capturing, I'm just seeing the light. I'm not seeing the colors. That lady's got this beautiful red gown, but the red can actually distract you from reading the light. You're thinking about the color, you're not thinking about the light. And by shooting in black and white, and particularly if you've got a mirrorless camera, when you set that picture style, that picture profile, you see that through the viewfinder as well. And so that's really powerful. That's really helpful. And so you're seeing the light instead of seeing the colors and seeing the distractions. And of course, the good thing with using that black and white preview, that color mode, is that if you're shooting raw, then you're capturing the raw file. You're not capturing the black and white file. You still get all the raw color. It's just a normal raw file. So when you pull it into process, the only things that are actually black and white are the JPEG things. So that if you're capturing JPEG plus a raw, the JPEG will be black and white, but the raw file will be color. And the preview in the raw file will be black and white, because they just put a little JPEG inside the raw, and that's your thumbnail. But when you bring it into Lightroom or Capture One, and it creates its own thumbnail, and now you get to see the raw file with all the color again. So you still get to have all of the joys of working with a raw file, but you're seeing the world in that moment with a black and white perspective. It just means you're thinking about light, because the light is what's going to make your shot. And you can use the camera, to turn off that part of the brain that's always thinking about color, or that gets distracted by color and distracted by the subject, and just to think about light. Because what you're doing is you're learning to see light the way your camera does. That's a really important thing to think about. How does your camera see light? Because with our brains, we see something that's in the dark. We see something that's in the sunlight, but our brains can actually put all that together, and we create a different version inside our heads. Well, our camera can't do that. You know, a camera wants to show us what it sees. It's being honest. It's, you know, it says, well, you know, I only see light. I can't actually process it because I don't know how you want me to process it yet. And so we capture the raw file and we see what the camera sees. So we're learning to see light. You know, there is this idea that you can get it right in camera. And, you know, that's kind of possible, but I don't think it's something to strive for, because if you're trying to get it right in camera, it means you're not using all of that wonderful information that a raw file has. A raw file's got so much in there. The potential to go from the raw file to other things is wonderful. That one file could be 100 different kinds of pictures. You can change how it's going to be. So the potential of it is there. And so I don't think the goal should be to get it right in camera. The goal should be to capture a really good raw file that you can that you can enjoy tearing apart when you get it onto your desktop, and to see where that can take you. All right, we won't talk about campfires today. Up to 9 o'clock. Light and character. So I said before that the angle of the light is what gives character to your scene. You know, and here we're talking soft, abundant angled. You know, it's just a top-down shot, but I've got that very soft light that's coming through the window. And I guess the flip side of it is to think about, is this light giving something to my character? Is this light revealing something of my subject? Okay. And that's, you know, that's how I decide whether I like the light or not. Is that light revealing something about my subject? You know, if you think back to some of the shots we saw in the judging tonight, quite often what I was saying was that the light was fine, but it wasn't actually doing anything. It wasn't revealing anything about the subject. It wasn't adding any character. It wasn't bringing something extra to the scene. And so you just want to think about, is this light actually doing something to reveal something of the subject? You know, like if you spend a weekend out and you take like a couple of thousand shots, and you go back and you sit down on the desktop with all those shots, and you look through all those shots and you see which shots was the light doing something that really worked. You know, look back through your shots of the day or of the weekend, and just, you know, see which ones worked, and try to tune into that and say, well, actually, I really like those ones when we were shooting back into this light, or when we were going through some trees under there, or where there's a particular style that came out of it, and try to think about the moment you shot that image, and try to connect the image you're seeing on your screen with the moment that you took it, what was happening and what was the light doing. You know, look for those bits in your set that you feel really worked the best, not because the subject was interesting, not because it's, you know, because it's a flower or a person or a bird or a subject that you really liked, but because the light was interesting. Look for those and try to connect up your experience with the actual photo as it came out, and say, what was the light doing when I shot that picture? And that's what I mean. I kind of like turn that around then. And when I think about what kind of light works for me, and then when I go out to photograph, I'm not looking for subjects, I'm looking for light. You know, I will literally walk around a city, and I will basically look down the laneway and think, I like the way the light's coming in that laneway. I'm just going to see if there's anything to shoot down here, because I'm looking for light, not subjects. There's subjects everywhere. There's always something that can be a subject. You know, I don't think the world is short of subjects, but we don't always like the light when we get to shoot that subject. And so I'm saying, start with the light, make that the thing the absolute most important thing. Start with the light and let the light guide you. So when you're out there walking, whether you're on the beach, whether you're in the forest, whether you're in the laneways, look for the light and then look to see, is there a subject in this light that I can work with? And that's my final slide. Notice how the artist used light to draw the viewer in. Okay. Happy to take some questions. I know you've all been very, very quiet back there. And I hope I haven't bored you all to tears.
No, actually, thank you, Ewan. You shed a lot of light on the subject. Boom, boom. Actually, when you were talking about the custom settings, I'll be into my camera manual tomorrow.
So will I.
Yeah,
looking at the custom settings, because I've tried to get into the habit of just returning the camera to a baseline setting before I return the camera to the camera bag. Right. But I don't always remember. So I drag it out of the bag, and I think I've got that sort of standard settings that I have it on. And as you say, you know, the ISO's up in the sky somewhere or in a very bad place. So that was very enlightening. Thank you.
One of the things that happens too is that in the act of actually grabbing the camera and pulling it out of the bag, you roll one of the dials and suddenly the camera is not where you thought it was. You know, and that's where the custom dial is so good. You know, the first thing I do is that I turn on the camera and then I check which custom mode am I on. Am I on C1, C2, or C3? You know, because with my usual cameras, C1 is F2, C2 is F8, and C3 could be, you know, it could be for stars, or it could be for, you know, for slow motion, or, you know, that's something which I change about. But C1 and 2 is just basically F2 and F8. They're the two things that I need to use. And most of the time it's F2.
Okay.
Ewan, you spoke about two types of light, exposure, exposing to the right and zones. Well, I've heard and read about zones, don't use, but read. But what's the term exposed to the right mean? Are you referring to the hologram? What?
The histogram there, yes.
Histogram, yeah.
So the idea goes back to JPEG days. So in the days of JPEG, you didn't have the raw file, and that in order to get a bit more of that dynamic range, you would shoot things with a fairly flat kind of profile, and you would actually overexpose things just a bit. And depending on the profile that your camera has, and it's actually something we still do with video. So if you shoot in video, you're probably going to shoot with a log gamma, and the log gamma lets you add in a couple of stops of light, and you're just capturing a lot more information off that sensor that you're able to pull back with the right kind of processing later on.
So exposing to the right, you're basically saying ear on the side of over rather than under exposure.
That's right. The theory being is that if you underexpose, it means you're capturing less data. So black means you don't have data. White means you've captured data. And when you overexpose, so long as you're within the dynamic range of the sensor, you can pull it back.
Right.
That's if you don't screw it up.
We can't guarantee that.
That's where it gets a little bit tricky. It's very, very easy to screw it up. Like I say, it's something that I see a lot with the video side of things, where you know, it's not so practical to shoot raw with video. That's quite demanding. The technology is not quite there yet, and so you have to shoot everything with log gamma. And you end up basically working in this entire exposed to the right kind of paradigm, and it works quite well. But it means you've lost all of the latitude when you blow out the highlights, And if you're not careful, it's very easy to blow out the highlights where you didn't expect to.
Mm.
And when you were talking about the metering and the spot metering, and I understand what you say when you put the spot on somebody's face as opposed to their dark shirt, you get a completely different result. But what metering setting do you prefer?
I just use the standard, the whole screen.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I just use the whole thing because, you know, the cameras are going to take an average of the screen, right? So in general, if I've got a complex scene where some things are really dark and some things are really bright, well, in general, the camera's going to get it, it's going to get halfway between the dark and the light. It's generally going to be okay. It's generally going to be in the ballpark. And usually the subject I'm trying to actually expose for is actually halfway between. That's quite typical. The problem is when it's not actually typical. And that's where to use the exposure lock is so handy, where you can say, I'm just going to point it up to the bright part of the sky and get my lock, and then come back down to my scene that's got both the bright and dark. And now the dark is very dark because my camera is actually exposed for something very bright. Or you can flip that around if I want all the detail in the shadows and I'm happy to let the background blow out, and that's the thing I do too. Then you could point the camera down towards, the shadows on the ground, read the light off there. And now when you bring it up, everything's going to be very bright.
Mm-hmm.
And so how far you point your camera towards the dark or the light when you hit the exposure lock is simply how you control how much you're going to skew your exposure to the light or the dark within the scene that you're framing.
Mm. Okay. Yeah, and of course you've got the exposure compensation dial.
That's right. That's right. And you can actually combine those two things too. And then when you get to a point where you've played around with the lock, you've gone and changed the ISO for God knows what reason, you've done your exposure compensation, and you just need to reset the camera, then I simply flick that dial from C1 to something else and then back to C1. And now my camera is right back onto the baseline. I know exactly what it's going to do when I press the shutter next.
Mm.
Yeah.
Very good. Very good.
Mm.
Are there any other questions for you? All quiet.
With your custom functions, Ewan, with the ISO, do you normally leave it on auto ISO and set limits, or does that vary depending on which custom function you're on?
Generally, I'm on the auto ISO the whole time. It's rare that I come off it. If you're doing work that's on a tripod, anything that requires a tripod, I don't usually need the auto ISO because the camera's stable. But if I don't have the camera on a tripod, then generally what I want is that I want the auto ISO, but I also want to set what shutter speed the camera will accept. So it's not just a case of turning on the auto ISO. You also want to say, don't let the shutter speed go below 1/200th of a second. And that's a point which I picked because I don't always sort of hold still while I'm taking shots. I might be walking and then I kind of pause and grab a shot, and I might not have paused totally, and I'm still kind of, like I'm not always terribly stable when I take a shot. So I just want a little extra shutter speed just to make sure that the shot is going to be sharp enough to use. Because the worst thing you can have is a shot that's just a little bit blurry because I wasn't standing still enough. Just a little bit of blur is the worst thing in the world. You can have all of the ISO noise and grain in the world, and that's not as bad as just a blurry shot, right? So in general, if we aren't actually on a tripod, I'm going to use the auto ISO. And usually if I'm on a tripod, then it means that the shutter speed doesn't really matter. And so I can just go with, like a comfortable ISO that I get the maximum dynamic range. And that's something that we tend to think about think about ISO as being a problem in terms of noise. And ISO is not really a problem in terms of noise. The biggest problem with ISO is actually dynamic range. So depending on your camera, as you climb up the ISO, typically these days, the best cameras, you'll get to 6400, and that's where your range starts to actually drop off. And instead of shooting at 14 stops, you're actually shooting at 10 stops of range. And that means your photos don't have, you know, the nice tones, and they don't have the tonal detail, and the colors aren't quite right because you've actually lost some of the range. And that's the problem with the higher ISO speeds. Yeah.
Ewan, are you basically therefore saying that on a camera, if you want the best dynamic range, use the lowest ISO it will set?
Well, it depends on the camera, but usually you'll so on something like the Panasonic S1H, that's a 24 megapixel full frame camera, but it's got dual ISO circuitry. So if I'm at ISO 200, I get the same kind of quality and the same dynamic range as ISO 4000, because the camera has two different circuits for two different ranges. Okay, so you have to get to know the camera and get to know where the camera is strong and where it's not strong. But usually you'll be able to go up to something like on a standard SLR, you should be able to go to 3200 without any kind of drama, and maybe even to 6400 without seeing things really change.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, any other questions for you?
Ian, you do realise that most of the people have their microphones muted, don't you?
Yes, and if they want to ask a question, all they have to do is unmute.
If they know they're muted.
There's Michael. Hello, Michael.
They muted themselves, Arthur.
Well, we also normally expect people to mute when there's a presentation going on. It saves distractions from background noise, and we did have a few earlier on. So I did actually do some active muting tonight. I don't always do so. But obviously at this point, if anybody does have a question, for sure, unmute, stick up your hand and ask away.
Where you been, Michael?
Been doing judging training.
He's back at his judging.
Sorry?
He just put his face in on mine just to say hello.
That was a brief appearance there.
It's a brief. He's coming back for another appearance, so get ready.
Oh, okay.
There it is. Hey,
Hi,
Michael.
Hi, Michael.
All right. Well, if there are no further,
unfortunately, tell them I'm unfortunately stuck on another Zoom meeting.
If there are no further questions for Ewan, we'll move on to the next part of the night, which is we'll get Liz to organise